Alright, we are onto the handguard now. I'm going to be making the handguard out of 3 pieces of steel here, just like this. Now, on each side of the sword, there are 5 rounded stud heads right in the middle here. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, I make studs out of something like this. I can kind of round off this head and then, screw it in place. However, since this stud is too long, it would go through the handguard and into the sword. It's kind of a problem since the blade material is so tough. It is extremely difficult to drill. Never mind drill and tap 10 holes. So this time I'm abandoning this style and I'm gonna go back to my roots, which is these guys. This is a 3/4 inch ball bearing. I just need to cut them in half and then I'll plug weld them from the back side so that you can't really tell. They just look like the head of a stud sticking out. Obviously the studs are just decorative, there's no actual function, so, having a stud that screws in doesn't mean anything. Now, the problem with these ball bearings is that they are extremely hard. I once tried to cut one in half with a bandsaw and I ruined a brand new blade in like 10 seconds flat. So the only choice is abrasives, but how do you clamp these things down? I've tried putting these in a vise before, but the problem is once you cut through, the vise kind of like closes down on the saw blade. So what I've come up with is this. I have welded down 10, or I think there's actually 11, just to have a spare ball bearings here. By the way, check out the beautiful coloring from the heat of the welding there. They kind of all looked a little bit different. Anyway, I have made this stack here so that basically a little more than half of each ball bearing is exposed. And all I'm going to do is just take my angle grinder and just kind of like run it down this piece of sacrificial aluminum and cut them all off. I've calculated that I'll have a little bit more than half of each ball bearing left, which will give me a little bit of meat to, manually grind off and size them all perfectly after the fact. Alright, so we've got the rough cut pieces of the guard here. You can see I have marked out a measurement. This is the exact width of the blade. Basically all I'm going to do is I'm just gonna kind of machine off the end of these and make them the precise size. That way they'll just all line up. I got 4 of these and then 2 of the bigger pieces. And I'll also drill the holes for the studs while I'm at it, so the studs will be perfectly centered and perfectly spaced. And I'll even clamp them in the vise like this so that the drilled holes will go through both pieces, just to ensure that the studs are in exactly the same location on both sides of the sword. Does it really matter? No, but will I sleep at night? Yes. Okay, I only have so many hands here, so bear with me. Let's see if we can get this on here. We were shooting for 10-390. I would say we're really close. Alright, we've got all our holes drilled here, everything spaced out nicely. I'm just kind of mocking these up. They're not actually held in place in any way. They look pretty good. I just got to clean up all the rust and kind of put some divots on the backside so I can weld these pieces together and then plug weld each of these in place. And I've got 2 halves of my handguard. Alright, so I've got all my holes painstakingly laid out here. And I'm getting ready to weld this first little stud on here. These guys are very helpful. These are actually plug welding pliers. And this is a copper pad, so you can't weld to it. You know, the weld won't stick to it basically. But on the other side, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you should. It's kind of got like a fork design. It leaves the hole open so I can still get in there and weld or plug weld that one spot without having to move anything else. Alright, so I've got my 2 identical halves of the handguard. I will position these exactly on opposite sides of the blade so that the studs will look like they line up perfectly. As you can see from the heat discoloration, I've welded these pieces together in 8 places on each side. Just some significant tack welds. You can kind of see here what I did is I dished out pretty significantly with a die grinder, and then I welded into that spot almost like a plug weld, but this is plenty to hold these together. I didn't want to do full welds because these are nice and flat. They don't, you know, they don't rock back and forth in any direction. And if I had done full welds, the amount of heat would have just warped these things like potato chips. And then trying to get them to lay flat, you know, on the surface of the sword would have been a complete nightmare. Okay, so I'm really bad about test fitting things. I haven't even done this once. Hopefully my measurements actually work out here. Let's just see. Get it lined up nicely. It should line up with the other side. Oh yeah. Perfect. I don't feel any difference on this side. Okay, that looks pretty badass. Okay, while we're doing a test fitting here, I decided to do both pieces. I would say we look pretty good. Everything kind of lines up nicely. I did cut these little pieces here to go in this gap. I should get it on the other side here. So it kind of gives it a, you know, one giant continuous piece look to it. You can see over here I did leave a small bit of material on this side so that I can sand this all back. Once this is all welded, I can sand this all back and this will all be, you know, flush basically. What I've got to do now is every one of these surfaces where there's pieces of steel touching, I'm going to heavily bevel, weld into those bevels, and then grind it all back so this just looks like one piece. There'll be no seams anywhere. I think I'm not gonna weld this seam. If I can clamp it well enough and it stays flat enough, I think I'll just leave it alone. It's gonna be really hard to kind of weld into here, grind it back, and then have it be at like a perfect 90. Okay, so for the handle, I'm going to do something a little different. I never really had the opportunity to do this because the blade that I use are usually, you know, 1/4 inch thick or so, and the handles are 1 to 1 1/4 inch thick. In this case, this is 1 inch thick, my handle is 1 1/4, and I think I can pull this off. What I'm going to do here, I don't know if you can see this, I scribed this little section. I'm going to machine out this perfectly centered spot here. This is going to be 1 inch wide, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the handle and I'm going to basically machine a square on the end of this that is 1 inch by 1 inch. So I'll be able to slide it into that slot, and then the handle will be perfectly aligned, you know, every way, all 3 dimensions. and it'll also give me more area to weld on, since I'll be welding around, you know, all sides of it basically. And then when I'm done, I can just stick that on there, and that will weld over the top, and it'll hide all the ugliness. Should save a lot of work, you know, cleaning up a bunch of welds, lining up the handle, which is always a huge pain in the ass. And finally, I think I might get a little more strength out of it. I doubt it'll be enough to make a difference. You know, my normal welds are just 10 times stronger than they need to be basically, but you know, with a project like this and with the amount of forces involved, you know, larger margin of safety is always preferable. Alright, so I've got my handle here, and I'm going to square off the last 1.25 inches of it. I'm not sure if I'm doing this right, if this is stupid or not, but basically I've got this clamped that way against the side of the table here. These things are a little anemic, but I tried pulling on the end of that as hard as I could, and it does not move, so hopefully it should withstand the forces of milling. I'm only taking 1/8 of an inch off of each of the 4 sides. It's not really a big deal, I don't think, but do not try this at home if this blows up. Never actually tried this before. I've extended the ram of the mill, this thing, as far out as possible, and then I've got it rotated off center so that I can hit this piece here. Obviously, due to the length of this piece, I can't center it in that area, and I can't have it on the back side because this is the reader for the digital readout, that thing. I'm gonna take it nice and slow. I'm gonna hand feed it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we got to drill the 2 materia holes in the blade here. Now, tricky operation given that this is pretty bulletproof steel. We'll call it bullet resistant, and how thick it is. So we're going to use this guy. This is a carbide tipped annular cutter. You can see the little carbide teeth kind of brazed on there. This is basically just a fancy hole saw. It's meant for this sort of thing. It's rated pretty close to the hardness of this material, a little less. I'm sure it's going to wear it out pretty quickly, but I only have 2 holes to make, so fingers crossed, right? One final note, to do this drilling operation, instead of, you know, pulling on this lever here and lowering the spindle, I'm actually going to turn that handle and raise the table into the cutter. It's got a nice long handle on it. I've got plenty of leverage, and I can also move it very slowly and consistently, so I'm not kind of, you know, shocking the cutter as it tries to go through this extremely tough material. Okay, well, that was a complete and utter failure. If you look carefully here, all of the teeth are missing. All of the braces that hold them in snapped off at the same time. And in fact, the cutter had a nice crack in it right there. I think that must have been the first tooth that let go. And it just kind of broke the cutter, and, you know, as it came around, each tooth just kind of subsequently broke off. I found 5 of the teeth. I think the 6th one went sailing somewhere, or it just shattered. Hard to say. Over here, looking in the hole, you can see a little ridge there and on the back side. I think what was happening is, as I was raising up the whole table into the cutter, the table must have been shifting slightly or sagging. I mean, this machine is 55, almost 56 years old now. It's probably not the tightest thing in the world. Okay, so new game plan here. I have turned the blade over because this one had a partial depth cut, and I was afraid that some of the broken teeth may be embedded in there. and as soon as I put the new cutter in, it could just jam up and shatter anyway. So I'm going to do this one first, and I'll do this one second, and hopefully, even if there are pieces of carbide stuck in that hole, I'll have, you know, carved out the other half of this hole, and I should be able to, you know, manually knock it out, or, you know, use a burr or some sandpaper to clean up the edges or something like that. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use cutting oil instead of coolant. I thought that heat would be a bigger concern, but I think lubrication is actually going to be the big deal here, considering how tough this material is. Finally, I drilled these little pilot holes. These are 1/4-inch holes. They go all the way through. The idea is when I put the cutter in there, you know, it's going to be like this, right? The cutter is hollow. It's going to be like this, and as the little chips form, they'll be able to drop through that hole. The idea is these little chips, some on my finger right there, they can kind of stay in the hole and get between the cutter and the workpiece. And since it's, you know, it's hardened steel chips, it's just going to greatly wear down this cutter very quickly, just because it's just going to be constantly grinding against the chips it has already cut. Furthermore, those chips can, you know, wedge in between the cutter and the hole, and they can jam it up. So that's another concern that I can hopefully avoid. By not using the coolant with the compressed air, I will have a compressed air gun that I can constantly be, you know, spraying in there and get as many chips out as possible. So basically, lubrication plus chip removal equals success, maybe? Oh, and I'm going to be using this to pull down on the spindle here, or the quill, I suppose. And that should hopefully give me some better feel. You know, this doesn't take a lot of effort to do, but raising the table with that lever down there, and you're raising, you know, it's got to be 400 or 500 pounds of the table, plus the 113-pound blank. It takes a lot of effort, so you kind of lose the feel as you're doing it. Doing it this way will kind of give me a tactile feel for how the cutter is doing, if it's binding up, or I can feel it kind of like grinding and shaking and so forth, but we'll see. Wish me luck. Well, that's it. 2 nice clean holes in there. I never thought I'd be so happy to make 2 stupid holes in my life, but that was about 45 minutes to do, you know, 1.5. That's still really hot. 1.5 holes. The little kind of through hole to let the chips come out worked out really well. I don't know if you can see in there. You can see the pile of chips that formed underneath there. If you look at the underside of this plug, it was like this before. This is the part that I cut, you know, halfway the first time. It looks like there might be little chunks of those teeth left. I see like a little sliver right there. It's really hard to see in the viewfinder. There's another one right there. I think that's embedded in there. I can't get that out. So it was definitely a good idea to come from the other side, otherwise this could have been a problem. Probably would have munched that cutter up in no time. Holes look pretty clean. You know, it's a little rough, but they feel nice and smooth. Just some sandpaper will smooth that out. And then we're on to the next part. Let's get this thing dipped in acid so I can get this mill scale off of here. I kind of had half a mind to leave it on there. It kind of looked right, but the closer I looked at it, it's all kind of like gouged and scratched up in random places, and it's just the rest of the sword is going to look too perfect, and I think it'll just look out of place. So acid dipping it is. So this is pretty much it for the blade. I acid dipped it overnight in vinegar, and then I used a whole bunch of sandpaper. You can see the bits and pieces down there to just kind of smooth it out. This is as smooth as I wanted to get it. I should take you in nice and close here. You can see what steel from the factory actually looks like. Despite the acid dipping and the sanding, this is how rough it really is. You can see all the little pinholes and just the roughness in general, and the kind of inconsistent nature of it. There's, you know, deeper, darker spots everywhere. Some of it's light. This middle section is actually somewhat uniform, and then it gets rougher down here. You can feel these divots. It's actually the roughest right at the end where the guard goes. I didn't want to remove any material from the flat part of the blade, since this is the part that bullets are going to be striking, and every little bit of thickness matters. Right, guys? Never mind that this surface will probably get, you know, pocked up to some degree from all the bullets hitting it. I'm not sure that anything will actually go through it, but I'm sure, you know, some 50 BMG will leave some sort of marks on the surface.